We are very blessed to have Dr. Paul Beljan with us this evening. He is a pediatric, well, I'm sorry, let me get it right. He is a pediatric neuropsychologist. I always say that incorrectly. So he's here to share with us what makes our kids tick. What is it about that gifted learner that makes them so different and so unique in their understandings? And we're very happy to have him with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to him so that we have as much time with him as possible. Dr. Beck, thank you very much.
Thanks, Colin. So if everybody doesn't mind setting their phasers to stun, so we won't have any interruptions. Usually I have a lectern in front of me, and I look at this, and but I'm going to be turning this way, so hopefully I won't read my slides to you. Also, I think the people online do not have the slides.
Correct.
Okay, so I will read them and then explain them for the most part. If you've never seen me lecture, feel free to ask a question. You stimulate the neuron, you get a much bigger payoff with me. Try not to keep your try not to make your questions too personal though, okay? Because that's confidential to you. So that being said, some shameless advertising first. These are the two books put out last year. I think this one came out in September, and that one came out in October or something like that. So it was a busy time. But the Misdiagnosis book is the second edition. I think it's pretty good. They really expanded a lot on it. And then the Large-Scale Brain Systems, you know, if you can't sleep, it's a pretty good book. So some of the things we're going to talk about tonight briefly are the bell curve and IQ, characteristics of gifted intelligence, common disorders and common misdiagnoses. A lot of these kids are misdiagnosed. Discrepancy model of learning, disability, and easy rule-outs, but I think these are switched by accident. And then kind of, if you think your child's gifted or your child needs to work with a professional, how do you do that? Who do you go to? That sort of thing. So I gave this lecture a couple of weeks ago somewhere, and I digress a lot, tell stories. So I didn't get all the way through it. If you want it, all you have to do is email me through the website, Belgian Psychological Services, and I'll send it to you. So first of all, this is a bell curve. It's how you take a population and compare them to each other, essentially. So in intellect, a 100 IQ is right in the middle. It's a 50th percentile. That's what average is. And on the Wechsler IQ test and most IQ tests, the standard deviation for IQ testing is 15 points. So technically, the range of average is 85 all the way up to 115. It's a 30-point range. It's really, really big, and I would contend that at 115 is quite a bit different than an 85, okay? Now, gifted IQ is all the way out here at 130, and you see it's 2.14%. So it's a much smaller percentage of the population. And if you go out another standard deviation, you're at 145, that's highly gifted. Another standard deviation, you're at 160, which is throbbing vein in the middle of the forehead gifted. And there was some research done some years ago that showed that there were more of those, that group, than was ever thought before. But the Wechsler people changed the statistics in the WISC-5 IQ test, and the WISC-4 had extended norms. So you could figure out IQs up to like 175, which is really amazing. I think now it just goes to 155. So anyhow, the thing that's interesting about this to think about is when you look at these differences, that this is most of the population right here, it automatically shows you how separated out a gifted child is from a lot of the population. If only 2.5%, 2.25% are out here, who do these kids interact with? Who do they relate to best? That sort of thing. And does the rest of that population understand them? And I don't mean just peers, children. I mean adults, professionals, that sort of thing. To put it into context, if you start at average 100 and you go down 2 standard deviations, you're at a 72 percentile, all right? And that's where mild mental impairment begins. So, 30 points from 100 is impaired. 3 points above shows you the mass difference between somebody who's impaired 100 from 70 to 130, the comparison from 130 to 100. So it's not absolute like that. It doesn't mean that a 100 looks impaired to a 130. That's not what we mean. But they're just very different is the point, okay? And that might mean that the gifted child is interested in or thinking about things that the other kids aren't. And a lot of times when the smaller amount of population is different than the rest, that smaller amount gets kind of held out as different, and assumptions are made about them, that sort of thing. And some of those assumptions can be false. So, incidentally, the 160, everybody heard of Jim Webb? Dr. Webb? He's a fairly famous psychologist. He's, I think, top 100 psychologists of the last century. And I was lucky enough to have him as a mentor in grad school and now. And also, he taught the only gifted doctoral level program in the country for its time. And I was lucky enough to take that course. So he talks about these 160 guys, IQs over 160, that tend to fall into kind of two categories. One is the ones that are kind of gregarious, really understand people, connect beautifully, and don't have a lot of the kind of isms that a lot of gifted kids have, or adults. And the other falls into the group that I guess might be considered more classically highly gifted, kind of curmudgeon-like or irritable, absent-minded professor kind of stuff, that sort of thing. So, someone who is a 160 that falls into the relatability spectrum, let's say, might be someone like a Jimmy Carter. I don't know that his IQ is 160, but he's awfully smart, and he related beautifully to people. And I don't know if you know, but before he was president and in politics, in the Navy, he was in nuclear science. Smart guy, right? So Bill Clinton is considered kind of like that too. That anybody who meets him usually is like, God, I felt like I was the only person in the world with this guy. And I don't know if it's a 160, but he's an awfully smart guy. A lot of others are not quite that way. So let's move on. These are characteristics and behavior patterns of gifted that can lead to misdiagnosis. So these are commonly seen things that if you don't understand gifted, you can easily mistake them and make an erroneous diagnosis. Now, I keep breathing heavy because from 3 o'clock to 5:15, I was just lecturing over at All Saints School. And we got a little bit into this. And what I told them is what I do primarily is I'm a diagnostician. I do a lot of testing, standardized testing, and I figure people out. And then, try to hook them up with the right kind of services that they need. And I really want to emphasize how important diagnosis is. Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to label my kid. Well, to me, it is what it is. And if someone is doing a very thorough job, and there is a diagnosis, well, you need that diagnosis to figure out what to do, right? If you don't have a diagnosis, then but there is a problem, you're kind of shooting in the dark on how to help it. But if you have the diagnosis, you get a better sense of what the origin is, and there's a greater bank of research on what to do about it. So diagnosing, testing is really important. Now that isn't to say that we find a diagnosis under every rock. We don't, and we try not to. We try to be very conservative about certain disorders that are more readily diagnosed. The problem with mental health is you come to a psychologist and we think you're there because there's a problem, so there should be a diagnosis. And a lot of people make that mistake. They diagnose something when there isn't one. So we're very careful about these, but these are the kind of things that lead to erroneous diagnosing. And when this happens, think about it. It's dangerous because if someone makes a diagnosis about your child and then acts on that or prescribes medication for it and the diagnosis isn't there, well, you just changed the trajectory of that child's life. It's a heavy statement, right? I mean, it is a lot. And it's important to, as much as possible, not allow that to happen. I want their trajectory to be the way it should have been, meet their karma. So, first one, asynchronous development. And a lot of stuff falls under asynchronous development. What it is development, most people think, goes at this kind of normal upward trajectory. But it doesn't. There's lags, and certain things are higher, certain things are lower, that sort of thing. If you are gifted and you have these lags like anybody else might have, it looks more obvious, it stands out more, because people tend to want to relate everything to intellect. So if a very gifted child is doing really poorly in an area that seems asynchronous, out of sorts with everything else, it looks like something pathological. When in reality, having asynchronies is considered fairly normal for the gifted population. And when I say an asynchrony is normal within the gifted population, what I mean is within normal limits. There are certain asynchronies, or the behavior that looks like asynchronous that actually could be a disorder. So we just kind of muddied the water a little bit. I was really lucky in my internship and first postdoc. I got to test probably thousands of babies in neonatal clinics. And the thing you can tell when you test an infant with a Bailey scale is you can tell one that's really pretty advanced versus one who is not. But what you're really evaluating when you test an infant is you're just putting stuff in front of them and seeing how they respond, and then you code it in a certain way. So you're kind of looking at stimulus response kind of stuff. Okay? You're not looking at cognition because a little baby's brain, the cognitive part isn't wired up yet, otherwise they'd come out talking. That would be pretty cool. But they don't. So we have to look at them in other ways. And so if most of what I'm testing when I test an infant is going to be subcortical information, sensory information, basic motor stuff, that information in a baby's brain is pretty much autonomically processed. They're not thinking with words yet, they're thinking inferentially. So in one of the issues that's going on then, what it suggests in asynchronous development, is that what would make that baby smart? And if all you're testing at that point really is subcortical matter, it would suggest that part of the subcortex, the limbic area, based on how it processes information, how efficiently, how quickly, and so on, is going to be maybe a precursor to intelligence, okay? And here's the issue with it. Subcortical information that's processed, mad, sad, glad, scared, beating, fighting, fleeing, stuff like that, is excitatory stimulus, right? It ramps you up. That stimulus is sent via the neostriate variously to the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe has to figure out what to do with stimulus, and that's where inhibition comes in, or our modulator, that we're going to put a dimmer switch on something as opposed to a toggle switch in how we respond. Well, if you're 5 and your cortex is just developing and you're talking and doing all this stuff, but that subcortical brain is just chugging along and cooking at a high level, well, what happens is when you experience things, you very well might be experiencing them at a more intense, higher excitatory level. And when that information gets sent to the frontal lobe, it's too much for those little 5-year-old frontal lobes to inhibit it. Freud used to say, put a lid on your id. And I think this is what he was talking about, that you're trying to, can the frontal lobes inhibit subcortical process coming so that you can kind of keep your wits about yourself versus becoming at the will of your emotion, right? Okay, so if I am more or less at the will of my emotion, the will of my stimulus response, or my stimulus that I'm experiencing, what is it going to look like in the frontal lobe? It's going to look like behavioral dysregulation. So the kid that, I'll probably date myself. Anybody ever see Welcome Back, Kotter? Probably not, I probably wouldn't. Okay, remember Horseshack? Ooh, 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 right? That's motor disinhibition. He's all excited that he's got the answer, just like a gifted kid. I got it, or not even say I got it and blurt it out. That's not impulsivity, hyperactivity, necessarily. It could be, and you can test for that. More often than not, what it likely is it's affective dysregulation because the child has the answer. That's pretty exciting. I got to share this stuff. Okay? Same thing might happen with anger, with sad, feeling intensely sad, happy, feeling intensely happy. A friend of mine who taught in a gifted school, in middle school, she said every day was a soap opera in her class, and that nearly every child at one point in that day would express mad, sad, glad, scared. Every one of those feelings, but with intensity. And that intensity is what is asynchronous. Now there are other asynchrony things that we'll talk about, like handwriting lag behind, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So other things that are typically gifted, impatient with people during periods of intense focus. So it's that kind of hyper irritability about it. If I tell the child to stop reading, they get really upset, that sort of thing, because they're intensely focused. Again, if one of the things that we've always said about gifted is, Jim Webb used to always say, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. Makes a lot of sense, right? I've said since then, anything worth feeling is worth over feeling. So if I'm upset with being distracted off the book I'm way into right now, I'm going to be maybe just, irritated squared. Neglects duties in favor of reading or other interests. Okay, but again, keep in mind at a squared level, at a more intense level. The other thing is, in class, what happens if I'm bored in class and I got a 150 IQ? Well, I got a pretty entertaining brain then, and instead of listening to the teacher go over 8 times 7 for the umpteenth time, I'm going to entertain myself up here, and I'm not going to pay attention. Or I'm going to read my book, okay? And the example I used earlier today is, a gifted kid might read his book. A typical kid might, make an eraser animal with an eraser and pins. There's just a level of thinking of what's going on. The bottom line is this. If I'm taken with my own thoughts, or I want to read the book instead because I'm bored, one thing it really tells me is this, and you have to keep this in mind. Giftedness does not increase your development. You develop at the same trajectory as anybody else. You might seem more developed because you can speak intelligently and hold a conversation with an adult, things like that. But you don't develop any faster than anybody else. So if I bore an 8-year-old gifted kid, he's going to act like an 8-year-old, period. Make sense? And I think that's important to keep in mind because we've had a lot of parents in the past say, well, if I don't let him explain all the reasoning of why he doesn't want to go to bed at 8 o'clock, I'm inhibiting his linguistic ability and his development of argument from a lawyer's perspective. And my answer is no, you're not. You are rewarding inappropriate behavior. But the child, he can make good arguments and keep you hooked, right? Again, that doesn't mean it's developmentally higher. It just means he's using his intelligence for evil and not good. So, advanced and diverse interests, and jumps from one thing to the next. Dr. Webb always uses the example of being a grasshopper child. And some of these kids, this is interesting. I'm going to look at this for a while. Oh, that's interesting. I'll look at that for a while. What's that look like? Looks like ADHD, right? I'm not going to go totally into all of this. I'm going to maybe scratch the surface and fill myself up and move over here. Other kids will immerse in something for their entire life. I read something that Einstein, as a child, would float in the rowboat on the lake and think about light as a child, right? Now, let's think about misdiagnosis in terms of that concept right there. If I'm a child and I'm intensely interested in something, is that pathological? Because a lot of people would diagnose an Asperger's disorder. Because Asperger's get really interested in something and they want to talk at everybody about it. But what if you're Einstein? Was Einstein Asperger's? I don't think so. Everything I've read about him, he sounds incredibly related. Okay? So again, you see how very easy it is to make an erroneous diagnosis based on one symptom and how dangerous that can be. Right? Because now what we've done, let's say the child is deeply interested in something and we pathologize it and say that's Asperger's. Now he's going to get treatment for that disorder when he doesn't have it. It's pointless. But we've seen it happen. Narrow interest, this is the thing I just mentioned. Reluctant to move to new activities. Again, if you haven't soaked up everything you wanted from the activity you were in, you're going to be reluctant to move to something else. And if you always think about misdiagnosis, how rife is that for maybe OCD, oppositional defiant disorder? Every time we try to get him moving out of the house and put his book down, he has a tantrum, that sort of thing. So, making jokes or puns at inappropriate times, or even appropriate times. I love this one because one of the strongest indicators in a young child of giftedness is language development. And making a pun is a pretty advanced linguistic joke. And having humor in and of itself really suggests higher intelligence, okay? I mean, real humor, not a pratfall. So, other characteristics, judgment and awareness lag behind intellect and insight. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. This kind of goes back to that think of these children don't develop any faster than anybody else, all right? So, awareness and insight are really key things. One of the things that we do in my practice is when we do a full eval and the child is gifted and we figure out what's going on or what isn't going on and we can explain that, Not only do we teach that to the parent in detail, but we also bring the child in for a separate session at no charge and teach it to them. We teach it to them at a child level, okay? A couple of things that I want a child to take away from understanding about their giftedness. One is responsibility and accountability. Doesn't matter how smart you are if you don't do your work, you know? There's certain things that we all have to do, period. But a lot of gifted kids can learn something fast and want to move on and think they have it when they don't. Multiplication is a great example. I always use 8 times 7 as an example because it gave me so much trouble when I was a kid. If I asked you and you're 7th or 6th grade, and I say, what is 8 times 7? And you go, 56? You're wrong, because the answer is 56, right? As fast as if I say, what's your name? The answer is 56. And that's a really important concept to get your head around, because when you master your multiplication tables to that level, that becomes a procedural memory and takes no thought, that's the basis of all math. That is the cornerstone. And the person who was in the lecture or this afternoon that I was talking to has a PhD in mathematics, and she's like, you're dead on. Okay, so I know I'm right. If you don't master those tables, but you are a very intuitive mathematician, it almost doesn't matter. Because what happens when you have to take the SAT, right? And you're factoring 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 because you never took the time to learn it because you can grasp algebra at age 6, but you didn't do the underpinnings for it? Well, your error variance on your answer is going to go through the roof, right? You might add an extra 8, take away an extra 8, whatnot, who knows? You're nervous about the test, plug it into the wrong spot of the quadratic equation you're doing. Bottom line is you shouldn't waste time factoring 8s. You should know it automatically. The other part of that then would suggest that you're not going to get as much done on your ACT or SAT. You're going to get everything correct maybe that you do, but you're not going to get a lot done. Your score goes down, and first grade you hurt 15-year-old, 16-year-old you. Make sense? It's a real key issue. I think spelling fits for this, grammar fits for this. There's a lot of things that you only get through repetition. Now, the brain really works on repetition too. There's this thing called perception-action coupling. It talks about how the cerebellum assists cognition. That, you know, we used to think that the cerebellum had nothing to do with anything but movement, really. Well, it means little brain, and it actually cognates. So when you master a skill like 8 times 7, it seeds in your cerebellum, and when you're doing math, you can fire up that answer as quick as you want. Well, what does that do in real life? It frees your thinking to the most appropriate problem solving that you're doing, as opposed to factoring something you shouldn't have to think about. You only get that through practice. So what happens is we can accidentally delude ourselves. If that child understands multiplication, but he hasn't mastered those tables, it's not good enough. Okay? So it really goes into the second level of what we talk about with children. We talked about responsibility. That means you got to do the due diligence. Now, that might also mean that when you master something, you can move on earlier. That's great. But if it's not mastered, you're not budging. Okay? But the other part to me is humility. Right? I mean, everybody's met that gifted kid. I'm really smart. Okay? I had a kid sit across the table from me one time, more than once. And he looks at me and he goes, I have a 138 IQ. What do you have? And I'm kind of a smart ass. I said, I don't know, but I have a doctorate. What do you got? I didn't appreciate that one. The point there is this. I love this line. He was born on the intellectual third base. He didn't hit a triple. He didn't do anything to get that. He's born that way. So how dare you be pompous about it? How dare me as a parent influence that pomposity, if that's a word, right? And it happens inadvertently. Sometimes this bad thing happens with good intent. Oh, he's our little genius. Well, if the child isn't developing any faster than any other child, can a child take that in without getting an inflated ego? And what does a child do who has an inflated ego? Well, I don't have to do that. I'm smart. I get it. And then what happens? They start skipping stuff. They're not learning the depth of what they need to learn. And then when they really get hit with something difficult that takes some thought, takes some reading and study, that's stupid. Things come to me easy. We see this all the time. And you get a brilliant child who's dropping out of high school, right? It's sad. It happens. So, awareness and insight and humility is really key. Poor handwriting, very, very common and gifted. I can go on about this one too. What do most people think when they see poor handwriting? Oh, you must have a fine motor deficit, right? This fine motor doesn't work right. We rarely, if ever, see that. Think about it. If you had a fine motor deficit, wouldn't something have had to have happened to your brain in utero or at birth or something like that to cause that? Well, if none of that's there, what are the odds that that's true? And by the same token, maybe this child who has terrible handwriting, oh, I don't know, also happens to be a concert violinist and he's 8. That's fine motor, right? So you can't fake a skill you don't have. So fine motor for handwriting usually goes out the window, and it goes back to what I was saying up here. If handwriting is tedious and slow for me, and I can't get my thoughts down quickly enough, and it's boring, and I got other stuff I want to look at on YouTube or whatnot, I'm going to fight to get out of this. And if I make good arguments, I'm going to be let out of it. And that behavior is rewarded over and over. So then later when someone really pushes me to write, I say my hand hurts. Well, why does your hand hurt? Because I haven't developed the muscles. You know, you lift weights. If you haven't done it in a while, your muscles hurt the next day. Same thing with your hand. So certain things, again, have to be really focused on, and we have to override their arguments and say, I'm sorry, pal, you're doing this. Okay? Writing is one of those. And one of the bigger mistakes I see, too, is schools that say, all right, he can't write. Let's let him use the computer. Anybody take typing in high school? Best class ever. I didn't learn anything in high school except that. And what does it take? Remember the teacher standing at the front of the room? A, B, right? Over and over and over. And you can't look at your hands, they'll hold your head. Why? Because you have to get it mastered to a procedural level to make it efficient at all. Well, if the child doesn't want to take the time to learn handwriting, if you're going to take the time to learn home base on a keyboard, probably not. So they become inefficient typists too, and now I just don't want to do my work. Lacking interest in the details, that kind of is an example of what I was saying before. But again, the whole idea of math really falls into that. Or why do I have to use grammar if my thought is correct? See? Turning in messy work, working too fast, not seeing the value in taking time producing quality work, because it will be evaluated later. Unusual sleep patterns. This one is interesting. You know, there are those who, Einstein was this, have to sleep 10 hours or they just don't function, period. There are those who are gifted that sleep 4 hours and work beautifully. My wife's father is a cardiac surgeon, and he sleeps 4 hours a night. He does great. Now and then he'll crash and sleep 5. Dr. Nick Cummings, famous psychologist, sleeps 5 hours a night. He had a morning practice, an afternoon practice, an evening practice, did research and teach in the afternoon. He basically had a 20-hour day. Amazing. Now, that being said, sleep is incredibly important to watch for. Think about yourself when you don't sleep, right? Your cognition goes out the window, your attention goes out the window, you get irritable, snappy, everything falls apart. Sleep is really important in children. He was in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, that one or the European one, I forget, but put up a definitive study on sleep in children and said if you snore as a child, that is pathological, and that you should get a sleep study done. And the sleep study is really important because it might suggest apnea, which can get into medical problems, and if you have apnea, you're not sleeping deeply, you're not getting restorative sleep, therefore, you're going to have all kinds of behaviors, and now you're getting misdiagnosed again. So there's a slide later on that talks about one of the key things with gifted kids is rule out the medical stuff first. Okay? It's always important to do. Peer relationship problems, unless they're with like peers. We already talked about that. Okay, other characteristics, sensitivity and intensity. I was working with this little boy, what is he, 6, I think? And I was testing him, and 150 IQ, brilliant kid. And we were doing this test where he has to draw the line along the road to the finish line. And he's a race car driver. You got to stay on the road, okay? And he went way out, and I go, "Wow, you went way out. Come back in." And I laughed. And he was so offended with me, he walked out of the room. He thought I was laughing at him. I mean, he's hypersensitive to that. So, just the way he is. It doesn't mean that it's pathological for anything. It's just that's how he is. He came back. strong-willed power struggles. You know, if I have strong belief in something, but I don't have a lot of life experience, I'm going to argue the heck out of that belief, whether I'm right or wrong, because I don't know that I'm right or wrong, right? And so I'm going to stick to my guns, and because of my intensity, stick to it even more. Again, always think of the misdiagnosis. Looks pretty oppositional, but basically comes from a belief system that isn't oppositional. And we'll talk about this later, but when you think about something like oppositional defiant disorder, that's a made disorder. Those kids aren't born that way unless they have like a Machiavellian gene. Really good book, Evil Genes. But they're born, they're made, they're not born that way, okay? There was a guy the other day I saw make almost the same remark about bullying, and he said, bullies aren't born, they're made. Makes a lot of sense. Same thing with oppositional defiant. Boredom, if educationally misplaced. You know, the fascinating thing about this from, you know, what I get to do for a living is there are times where we've said, bump the kid to another class, and their behavior is horrendous, they're disturbing everybody, bump them to another class, everything goes away, and miraculous. Doesn't happen every time, but it happens. I had a child, when I first moved here, 6 years old in kindergarten at a pretty prestigious private school in town. That kid had about 160 math IQ. Brilliant, okay? He already is ferreting out algebra and things like that in his head. He's in kindergarten, and the school was sending him home with a paper with a giant 6 to color in blue. And this kid's going out of his mind. And he's acting up in class, he's walking out, he's kindergarten, flipping tables. And I try to talk to the school, I said, this kid's got 160 IQ. All our kids are gifted. Yeah, no. I've tested a lot of kids at this school. But, you know, sometimes it's the belief system of the school that's really unfortunate. And what I've told a lot of parents is, you know, choose your battle. You're going to try to change an entire school for your kid, or just pick another school that's going to be more appropriate. Sometimes that's the easier route to go and the better choice. Okay, resisting routine, repetitive practice, talked about that. Non-traditional, non-conformative thinking, I love this one. Thinking outside the box. You know, on the Wechsler IQ test, on the verbal items, you can get a 0, a 1, or a 2-point response. And you have this book that tells you essentially what the answers are, okay? And so a 2-point response is a pretty robust response. Like for instance, if I say red and blue, how are they alike? And you say colors, perfect, 2-point response. If you say, well, red is red and blue is blue, you know, you're 0. So the point is sometimes a child will come up with an answer that is so incredibly creative, it's right, but it's not in the book. And we give them the points for it anyhow. So even among people who should be informed on this, they'll rigidly stick to what the book says and miss this brilliant thing that just happened. And that has to be pointed out. So know your professional. Shop for professionals. And we'll get into that later too. Hopefully that'll be fun because I'm going too slow. Let's see more. Fairness is the big one. Fairness goes along with competitiveness, right? Well, if I'm Mr. Fairness in my gameplay, I certainly am probably going to irritate the other kids and paint a big target on my back. But still, I'm going to take the target on my back because it's not fair. So again, there's that whole idea again of awareness and insight. You know, which hill do you want to die on? But if you don't have a lot of life experience and you're learning fairness and you get your head around it, that's a pretty important thing. Same thing with competition. What Jim Webb would say is, you know, he saw one of the things that he identifies as a sign of gifted is when the child has to everybody has to play what I want to play, and when everybody gets what I want to play, then I'm going to change the rules. So idealism fits with that too, and this is one of these things that can lead to a diagnosis like depression, like an existential depression. You know, think about it. If you're 4 and you're watching the news and you see, you know, a starving child in Darfur or whatnot, you know, just horrible stuff that should not happen, and you're 4 and you don't have the life experience to realize that what you're going to do by not eating your dinner has no impact on that poor child. In fact, if you eat your dinner, maybe you'll grow your brain more and you'll come up with the solution to that problem, right? But the child can so abstract and understand and empathize with the pain of that child in Darfur that they actually make themselves depressed. And that's what existential depression is. Something you can't do anything about, but you see the lack of reason in it. So we've seen that before. Impatient with failure and disappointment. Well, again, if I'm somewhat of a perfectionist, if things come easy to me, then when something fails, then maybe it's not worth it, or I'm not good enough, or whatnot. Again, hypersensitivity. And the self-critical perfectionism one is a big one too. This is a really tough problem that when we see it, we want to help the parent work it out as fast as possible, because this is the kind of thing that prevents the child from taking risk. If you've ever skied or rollerbladed or something like that, the axiom is, if you're not falling, you're not learning. Right? The child's really got to get their head around that. Nobody's perfect. There is nothing that is perfect. Therefore, perfection in and of itself is imperfect. Oversensitivity to criticism. That's what the little boy I was telling you about. And he took that as criticism by giggling when I was trying to join with him through giggling. Easily becomes angry or cries over things that go wrong. Again, that hypersensitivity, that intensiveness. All right, frequent diagnoses. Now, these lists right here, I don't know happens any more than anybody else in the gifted population. I don't remember the research on it, to be honest with you. This one here might happen a little bit more, but I also think there's a lot in this list over here that gets misdiagnosed. The biggest one really to me is bipolar disorder. And I'm talking from experience, I'm not talking from research. We have seen children in my practice before that are 4 years old and on 5 medications. 5, right? Now think about it. In my entire career, I would say I've never seen a child with bipolar. To me, I don't think the brain works that way. You might have some kindling kind of stuff and be bipolar later, but you're not going to be true blue psychotic bipolar, true blue bipolar at this young age. I don't think so anyhow. But little kids, mad, sad, glad, scared all day, every day, what does that look like? Bipolar. If I'm really smart and I'm stacking my blocks and I don't have the development yet to make a pyramid correctly, and I keep putting it here, it drops off, put it here, it drops off, I might get really mad and have a tantrum. 4-year-olds tantrum, right? That's what they do. It's not good at. So the problem is this. Let's say I take my child to the friendly psychiatrist, and if there's any psychiatrists in here, I guess you might get offended. The psychiatrist, and I say, my child tantrums all day, every day. He's mad, sad, glad, scared, squared. And the psychiatrist says, well, that sounds like bipolar disorder. Let's put him on Lamictal, or Abilify, or Tegretol, or whatever, okay? And I bring the child back a week later. How's Timmy doing? Well, he's not doing that stuff anymore. He's really not doing anything anymore, but he's not doing that. So the doctor says, well, I went by the right symptoms, and I treated the symptoms, therefore I'm right. It's called self-confirmatory bias, and that's what happened to the 4-year-old. Except what happened with that doctor was he started chasing symptoms. He started chasing side effects. So, you have this side effect now? We'll give you this. You get that side effect from this? We'll give you this. You get this side effect from those two things, how they interact, we'll give you that. And before you know it, the kid's on 5 meds and half drooling. When really what came out was, under medical supervision, took the kid off meds, tested, highly gifted, little bit of ADHD. That's all it was. Didn't even put her on stimulants. Okay? Now, I'm not saying I'm any kind of genius or anything, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that a 4-year-old just might tantrum when they can't get something done the way their mind's eye sees it, or that they get upset and they tantrum. That's what they do. So when I say think about who you go to see to have your child worked with, does this person understand gifted? Have they read a book? Have they been to a conference? Did they get a course in it? Did they get a lecture on it? Right? So I've taught in medical school and residency, and when it's my turn to teach this, they don't want to hear it. It's got nothing to do with life and death. It's the last thing they want to hear. They don't listen. It's their time to sleep when the psychologist talks. And then I get a call when they're in their first job. Now, what was that thing you said about gifted? Right? So they don't get a lot on this. So just because you have MD behind your name or even PhD, you don't get a lot. I told you, I took Dr. Webb's course in my doctoral program, 1992, I think. At that time,
just 1992, that was the only gifted course you could take at a doctoral level in the entire country. That's saying something. That means that every physician, every other PhD, every other psychiatrist, neurologist was not taught that. That was my age. Isn't that crazy to think about? You gotta vet your professional, okay? Because I still know one of my mentors in neuropsych, genius, I mean just so smart, love this guy. He will deny gifted. He'll deny it. So it's amazing. But that disorder is really, really unfortunate. ADHD, this is a common disorder. I don't know if that's any more common in gifted or less than not, but it's a common disorder. A lot of people consider it kind of an evolutional holdover. You know, the frontal lobes are the last thing on the evolutional block, and they're still working the bugs out. So be it. You can't diagnose it, or should not diagnose it, based on behavior only. Because if I only do it on behavior, I'm not factoring in the intellect. And what we say about the intellect causes intensity. And the intensity is going to look like ADHD in a child. You're overreacting to things, okay? You're responding to things that don't need to be responded to. You're not prioritizing to the right thing. So what happens in a physician's office, they use a checklist called the Vanderbilt. And the Vanderbilt is like a 20-question thing that anybody can see right through. And if I want my kid on Ritalin, yes, 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 right? And they'll say, wow, this looks like ADHD. Now you say he doesn't pay attention? Nope. Okay, well, let's try him on Ritalin. Pretty crazy, right? What if it was diabetes? And I say, well, Timmy gets tired when he has a lot of sugar or whatever. I don't know the symptoms, but you know, something happens here. I think he has diabetes. And instead of testing his blood or doing any kind of standardized assessment, instead we say, well, let's just try him on insulin and see if it works, and put him in a coma, right? The problem is when we're still at a level, human-wise, where if it's psychiatric, if it's in your head, and you can't see it, it doesn't warrant the same level of medical scrutiny and testing that other things do. And that's really unfortunate because most checklists, y'all know what checklists are? You know, like does Timmy fidgets, sometimes, always, never, right? Those things, there is no checklist that says, is Timmy brilliant? So even if I give you 20 different checklists, I'm going to miss the point if I don't factor in the IQ. Again, that isn't to say that if you're gifted, you can't be ADHD. Of course you can. But it means there's a big piece of this child that we're not factoring into understanding their way of being. Now let's take it the other spectrum. I showed you the IQ for mental impairment. Well, if the child has a very low IQ, I'm going to probably filter everything through that. Say, well, this is what mild mental retardation looks like, and that you don't do this, you don't do that, and so on. But they don't do that with the higher IQ. It's denied, okay? Because partly in our society, it's considered arrogant, I think, to say you got gifted or whatnot, which is unfortunate. So what we do with ADHD, we do a very, very detailed evaluation. We look at intellect, academic achievement. We look at sensory motor, visual, spatial, learning and memory. We look at all the levels of executive functioning and attention, and we put all that data into how each one relates to the other. Okay, because there is no lobule of ADHD. It's how large-scale brain systems work together. And the fascinating thing that you find with gifted is this, that they don't look different than any other ADHD child when they have it. But when they don't have it, their testing is fascinating because they do things that look ADHD, but there are certain tests that they do that we've seen over the years that if you have ADHD, you can't possibly perform this way. Okay? It's really cool to see. I don't go into detail about testing, but you can differentiate it in gifted. Oppositional defiant disorder, made not born, right? Think about it. If you have two parents who aren't drinking and drugging and beating on each other every night, they're home every night, you got a warm bed, you got 3 meals and snacks, lots of hugs, lots of I love yous, why would you be oppositional? Right? You wouldn't be. You'd be perfectly fine. Unless there's some real weird pathology going on, like your mom double binds you all the time. But you wouldn't be, okay? But if I'm gifted and I question everything, I'm going to look oppositional. So again, if I only go by the symptom, that can really lead me astray versus looking at the origin. What goes on in your house? important. Learning disabilities. This one, I could talk for 3 hours, but I'm just going to talk for 10 minutes on it. Excuse me. All right. Learning disorder in this country is horribly diagnosed in the public school system. They still use what's called the discrepancy model. And the discrepancy model is, if your IQ is 23 points higher, 1.5 standard deviations above your academic ability, and we're not going to say which academic, then you have a learning disorder. It's an arbitrary line. It's ridiculous. It's clinically unsound. And there's a ton of research that shows it's clinically unsound. It's not how you do it, okay? To diagnose a learning disorder, what you have to do is understand what does it take in the brain to produce that ability and test that. We have a way of testing math learning disorder. We don't even give a math test, and you can figure it out. We give the math test to prove it, right? But if you understand what it takes to produce math in your head, you can test it that way. If I do discrepancy, let's say a child has a 90 IQ, kind of low average, okay? To get 23 points below that, where would they be? 77? I'm not great at math. 77. Do you know that on a lot of achievement tests, you can't get that low? You can get 1 right and get an 80. There are some subtests you can get 0 right and get an average score. How's that for insanity? But what the school will do is just look at the score, and they won't look at the process of how you made a mistake, or if you're in that range. Or that if you have an 85 IQ, you can't possibly get 23 points below that. Now, here's the problem we've seen with gifted. A gifted child, intellectually, can compensate a little bit, all right? So, let's say you have a kid with a and I'm talking from experience, a 130 IQ, pretty bright guy, but his reading is 100, right on the money average. My experience, what the school will say is, well, that's average. What's the problem here? We got kids that can't read at all. So they won't use the same rule for the gifted kid that they will for the non-gifted kid. You see? So they won't get service because it's insanity. It's crazy. The other way they look at discrepancy is if you're functioning 2 grade levels below grade placement. So if you're a 3rd grader and you're functioning at a 1st grade level, you might get an IEP. But if your other discrepancy, your IQ versus your achievement trumps that, you don't get it. If you have the discrepancy with the IQ achievement and you're functioning at a grade that isn't 2 grade levels below, then this will trump that. So there's a lot of ways to shake off the hook. This is a big, big problem in the schools. Some are moving away from this. I think PD has, where they're doing more of a response to intervention kind of thing. They're looking at it differently. They're trying to intervene earlier, that sort of thing, which is really appropriate. But I had a kid at this very prestigious private school in town, and I call him Ascot Boy, because he came in at 15 years old, and he was so mature. I'm immature. I was visualizing him sitting there in a smoking jacket and an ascot. And he self-referred because he wanted to go to medical school, and he only got like I don't know, what's a high score? At ACT goes to 1,500 or something, let's say. He only got like a 1,300. My parents would have had a parade. And he was devastated because like, I'm not going to get into the school I want that's going to launch me into medical school. And he goes, I think I have a learning disorder. He's so smart. He said, because what happened to me was this. I realized that I had to keep rereading the passages on the reading part in order to pull all the comprehension out to answer the question. So like I said about math earlier, everything he answered, he got right. But he didn't get a lot done because the way he's doing it is inefficient because he has dyslexia. We tested him. He beat discrepancy. He doesn't have a discrepancy. But when we go beyond, there's a point on every test where you DC, you discontinue, and you stop. You get like 4 wrong, you stop, right? We always go way beyond that because to me, it's more important to look at how you make a mistake. For instance, if you spell mother M-U-X-T-Y, that's probably a phonological processing deficit. If you spell it M-U-T-H-R, it's phonetically correct, it's probably an orthographic dyslexia. You don't recognize, you don't consolidate the word. This guy, once he got past words that he hadn't seen before, you couldn't tell what he was trying to spell on a spelling test. Gibberish. That's phonological dyslexia. I don't have to score it. It's obvious, okay? plus he had all the language testing that fit it as well, that you would have, plus the history. So we were able to write a letter and the report and get him extra time on the SATs. So this is true, this is crazy. He, I think, is in his 3rd year of neurosurgery residency at University of Florida. Is that about the coolest thing in the world? And the other thing that's amazing to me is I always thought, Sally Shaywitz wrote a great book called Overcoming Dyslexia. She really kind of cracked the code, one of the early people. And she wrote about a similar story of someone, being a neurosurgeon. And it's like, wow, I've got one in my practice. So it's incredible. And the thing it shows you too, though, is that regardless of how intelligent you are, dyslexia doesn't have to hold you back, right? You can work, and there are circuitous things you can do. You can try to remediate, so on. There's a lot of very successful people with the disorder. This one is overdiagnosed and gifted. Have you ever noticed that a lot of smart people, engineers, surgeons, psychologists maybe, are a little compulsive? Kind of like things that, right angles on their desk and so on. Well, there's a joke about grad school that if you don't go into it with OCD, you better come out with it, right? Because that's the way you're going to get through it, by being a little OCD. And there are certain professions where errors are unacceptable. Architecture, engineering, surgery, psychology, if you're testing, right? You can't make an error. You've got to be OCD about that. And so we find that a lot of kids who are very bright have some OCD tendencies. They don't have the full-blown disorder, okay? But they just, I like it this way, okay? Which is very different than somebody who really has a full-blown disorder, and they do, they're doing crazy things like, cooking and using the Windex at the same time. That's kind of OCD-ish, right? Or, washing the classic washing the hands 50 times a day. We had a kid who, he had to be the first one through the door. Had to. He didn't freak out, right? Deck his sister to get to be the first one through the door. That's pretty OCD. But just liking things just so, that sort of thing, or being a perfectionist, that's not clinical OCD. Now, there's no test for OCD. There's some neuropsych stuff that can suggest it, but there really isn't any definitive test. I think you just have to find someone who's logical and reasonable and can explain why they think it is or is not. If you have this, if you've ever known anyone, this is a very debilitating disorder to have. It's terrible. Asperger's disorder, I think we talked about in this group. Did I talk about this a little bit?
Yeah.
Not the one from earlier?
A little bit.
A little bit. Way overdiagnosed. The problem with this one is it's not a disorder anymore. They subsumed it under autism spectrum. And I liked it when it was a disorder because it separated it out and made you understand that, okay, it's a problem, but it's not real. And some it can be more severe than others, but it's workable, it's common, and it is common. But the diagnosis is kind of nebulous. And a lot of people will try to diagnose it based on one symptom. So like I said, Timmy's into grasshoppers. He's always been into grasshoppers, and he wants to tell you everything he knows about grasshoppers and doesn't want to hear what you have to say. Well, that's Asperger's. Not necessarily. Asperger's is on the autism spectrum. There's a whole lot more to that. And there's a great test called the ADOS, Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, that can be done to really rule that in or rule it out. And again, it's important to rule it in or rule it out because how you treat that child is going to be very different. Okay? You can still have very high expectations, but there's going to be different kinds of treatment. And a lot of gifted kids are just kind of quirky, You remember, what was that show? Geek something? Freaks and Geeks, right? I had a kid one time who had to wear yellow. Had to wear yellow. And that, if it was just yellow socks, okay. If it was all yellow, all the better. He just loved yellow. He's not Asperger's, but someone tried to say that he was. He was the nicest kid you've ever met in your life. Really relatable, understands feelings. A major depressive disorder, we talked about that one. Let's see, narcissism. This one is thrust on people. It really is. For this area. Narcissism really is a developmental disorder. You can think of it rather Freudian or object relations, but the bottom line is you are prizing yourself because others didn't prize you. It can be really sick. There is malignant narcissism and benign narcissism. I will not talk politics.
Are you saying Trump is gifted?
No. Remember I showed you the lower scale? This disorder, I think you can have kind of a pseudo-narcissism where it's thrust on you. So for example, if all this child's life we call him our little Einstein and teachers call him our little Einstein, developmentally he doesn't have the wherewithal to really take that in, and I'm little Einstein, right? And now he equates high intellect with I don't have to do anything, which is so wrong. And we've had more than one teenager who have dropped out of school, failed their way out, get a high IQ, but they don't like the way the teacher teaches it, so it's dumb. It's not as good as Wikipedia says, so it's dumb. And therefore, I'm not going to do it. And they don't have the developmental insight to realize, 15-year-old you is really destroying the opportunities for 25-year-old you. And this is a really sad one. I really coach parents when I see this a lot on, the child comes first, the IQ is down the road. There's things you do for it, obviously, but so on. Avoidance, schizotypal, I'm not going to talk about those are kind of rare. So let's see, disorders that commonly involve gifted. So again, these ones, it's not going to be any more than anybody else, I don't think. Maybe this one a little bit more. Allergies. Now, I've heard this one taught a lot. I'm not aware of research that really bears it out, though. But it's something worthy to check out. Hypoglycemia, the theory behind that is, and I don't know that that's been borne out either in the research, but the theory behind it is this. If you're smart, your brain is a gas hog for sugar because it fuels on that. And therefore, if you are burning more gas, you could become more hypoglycemic and you need a mid-morning snack and a mid-afternoon snack. And when we talk to a lot of parents about their child, and your child has tantrum behavior, irritable behavior, whatnot, what time of day does that happen? Oh, usually mid-morning. Well, bingo, peanut butter snack or something like that, behavior goes away. Parent-child relationship, this can come in many forms. You get the parents and the child who are very similar, and that frequently causes conflict. And by the same token, the parent and the child who's very, very different causes conflict. The child that questions everything, and the parent doesn't have the tolerance for it. We get other parents who are just kind of an icebox, and they're so over-intellectualized with numerous degrees and stuff that these can't relate to a child, or they expect their child to be an adult. And it's too much to put developmentally onto a child and causes anxiety problems. Or then the thing of, cracking the whip too hard. An A isn't enough, you got to get an A+. Silly stuff like that. We've seen that before. Okay. So, I got about 15 minutes left. Any questions, first of all, before I move on to the next thing? Thoughts? Is all pretty on the money for y'all? All right. I'll take this one as a yes. Easy stuff to rule out. And these are some of the most common things that parents complain about in our office, and they're super easy to rule out. Short term, well, first of all, we think about base rates. So, again, if a base rate is a way of clustering symptoms along with life. So, in other words, if you didn't have an in utero injury, if you didn't have a birth injury, you didn't have seizures, you didn't have head injury, and so on, what are the odds that you would have a set of disorders, right? Or if you're a male, what are the odds that you're pregnant? You can rule it out pretty fast. And it's a way of short tracking testing too. You don't have to give as many tests. So short-term memory. So a lot of times a parent will come in and say, well, Timmy has a short-term memory deficit. Really? Why? Well, he can't remember what his homework is. Well, one, that could be a choice. And two is, if I have a little bit of inattention or I'm just not paying attention because what's in my head is more interesting, and the teacher says something like, you have math homework, do page 37, do every other problem in the left-hand column. You miss one word of that, you don't know what your math homework is, right? So you come home, your mom says, you got homework? Yeah, I got math. What do you got? I forget. He didn't forget. It didn't get encoded. It didn't get there in the first place. If I ask that same kid, what'd you have for breakfast? Eggs, right? You can't fake it if you don't have it. How impaired would someone be if they had a short-term memory deficit? It means I could give you the same magazine every hour and you wouldn't know it. That's profound, right? You'd be incredibly impaired if you had that disorder. You couldn't learn because you can't keep it in short-term memory long enough to get it to long-term memory, okay? So the odds are very, very low and there's simple ways to kind of rule it out. One, you can't fake it if you don't have it. If I give you 5 different encoding tasks and you do 1 that's perfectly fine or even high, then you can't have that disorder. It's not going to ebb and flow. It's either there or it's not. So if I can close the door on that pretty fast, it opens up a bunch of other doors to say, well, maybe it's this, let's check these things out, right? And get a more accurate diagnosis or rule out. Processing speed deficit, we all heard this one. Anybody know how fast neurons communicate? Hundreds of thousands of milliseconds, super fast. They use this thing called a magnetoencephalogram to figure it out, all right? It's incredibly fast. You know what we test it with? A stopwatch. We are not testing sleep. I love this line from one of the David Letterman lists. How do you know you have a dumb dog? There's a long delay between bow and wow. That would suggest a speed deficit. This is the easiest thing in the world to rule out. And the problem with it is this. The Wechsler IQ test is the most widely used IQ test out there. There is an index called Processing Speed Index. That index has 2 tests in it. One is, well, they're both paper pencil, but one has to do with drawing a little bit, all right? If I'm a gifted kid and I hate paper and pencil stuff, and I'm a perfectionist, what do you think the odds are that I'm going to do that fast or do it perfect? And if I do it perfect, then I don't get as many done, I don't get as high a score, right? Let's also say on the other test that's called symbol search, it's this cancellation task. That again, I want to do it right. I don't care about how many I get, I want to get them right. Because I know I'm having my IQ tested. So again, I take my time and I double check everything. I get a low score. Because I did it slow, it doesn't mean I'm slow. Now, there's another test called block design. And block design is you have a series of blocks and you put them together to match a design that I show you. Okay, it starts with 4 blocks, moves all the way up to 9 blocks. You can earn bonus points for doing it fast. Gifted kids usually go do this really fast and they get high scores on it. You can't fake it if you don't have it. Therefore, if you did slow on the 1 set and you blew this away, or I do a language fluency task, tell me all the words that are animals in 1 minute and you get a 98 percentile, you did that pretty quick, okay? So again, we have to look at the qualitative nature of the task. What was the child thinking when they did it? Well, I wanted to get it right, so I did it slower. Versus just the score, okay? And that's the way to look at this stuff. And a lot of people, they don't know that. You know, a lot of people went to grad school and never thought about what they were taught deeply or chewed it up some more and came up with something on their own. At the risk of sounding arrogant, that was taught to me. I didn't come up with that one. Auditory processing deficit. I've changed my thinking on this one a little bit. This one is pretty heavily diagnosed. And a really good friend of mine is a speech-language pathologist. She's really outstanding. And she's an advocate of this. And for years, I've really poo-pooed it because if you can't process audition, then how do you speak correctly, right? So she had a different take on it that we've really been looking at, which is basically the only child you're going to see this in is a child who has phonological dyslexia. And that makes sense because the way phonics go together into graphemes and stuff, you know, unless you can really pick out the details of the sound, it's not a massive problem that you don't understand language, but you don't understand, so this becomes this, that sort of thing, right? That can really throw you off. So this, though, I think needs to have a more robust evaluation. So, for example, if we have dyslexia now, we look really closely at our language testing, really close. If that still doesn't convince me, I'll refer the child to an audiologist. I've never had an audiologist refer to me and say, I think your child has auditory processing deficit, you should check his phonics, right? So it's not going both ways. But this is, I think, pretty overdiagnosed, frankly. Sensory integration deficit, everybody heard of this one? Okay, well, what I've been saying all night, subcortical processing is ramped up. Therefore, it's gonna look like more sensory issues. Can't stand the tag on the back of my shirt, the seams on my socks have to be just so, right? Can't wear denim, gotta wear flannel or whatnot. Well, is that a sensory integration deficit? Or does that mean my sensory processing is incredibly exquisite and processing more that my frontal lobes can't handle it and push to the background? Right? Think about how your olfactory bulb works. You walk into a room that stinks. Not horribly. But if you stay in there, your olfactory bulb will equilibrate to it, and it doesn't bother you anymore, right? Well, frontal lobes and sensory is kind of the same thing. I don't like tags on the back of my shirt either, but I can tolerate it. I can put it to the background. So to me, frequently, sometimes, this might suggest ADHD or something like that. But to me, it's not a disorder if it's too much of the sensory. It's a disorder if it's not enough. And that's the kid that throws himself against walls or is throwing themselves in the couch or something. The treatment for this is a sensory diet, right? And it doesn't fix the problem, though. If I deep hug a child, or I have them wear a weighted denim jacket, or rub their back with a rabbit pelt, they calm down, okay? Well, I'd calm down too if you rub my back with a rabbit pelt. The problem is 5 minutes later it comes back. All you did was soothe the subcortical brain enough that it went away, you feel better, and then you start experiencing again, and it comes right back. So it doesn't mean that it's not integrated correctly, it just means it's too much at that time. And what I wrote, caveat, I've never met an adult with this disorder, ever. Never met an adult with auditory processing deficit either. Yeah.
So when they get sensitive like that with something, I like help my daughter like with clothes. I'll just try and distract her or like go do something else, and then she forgets about it. She's okay. Is that
Exactly.
what you're supposed to do?
You're doing something else until it's forgotten about.
Yeah, and then she's fine.
You know, for
She
some
wears
kids, they
outfits
just
all day.
can't. So you buy them. What I think Under Armour sells stuff that doesn't have a label in it.
Yeah.
It's no big deal. But again, I wouldn't consider it something diagnosable. It's just something to work with. I like how you do that though. Distractibility.
Yeah. Well, I used to like if she really freaks out, I'll be like, okay, pick something else. But some days I'm like, you wore this like a week ago and it didn't bother you at all. Like just let's go do this, and then she'll get over it.
Yeah,
She'll wear it
I
all
use
day.
distraction all the time with kids. Works like a dream. Oppositional defiant disorder, like I said, I already talked about this, This is made, not born. And here's more of it. And then we talked about learning disabilities. I've got about 4 minutes. So we talked about that a bit. Now, real fast, we'll go through this. How do you know who to see? Vet your professional, okay? Ask yourself, what is the origin of the problem? Could it be medical, brain-based, learning-based, emotional, or trauma-based? If these aren't there, check out medical. Medical. There's a lot of behavior around thyroid, and if thyroid disorder is frequently underdiagnosed in a child, they don't look at that. It's not, you wouldn't expect it, but it's something, hey, run a panel on the thyroid, let's see. It can make a child look agitated, can make them look anxious, can make them look lethargic and depressed. All kinds of things. This is one of the first things you do with an adult if you're going to go using medications. Check that thyroid. Bladder infection. Back up urine into your system. This is one of the first things you check with old people, because if you have a bladder infection, it makes you crazy. You act up. Food allergies. This is a big one. We've seen kids that you're thinking, what the heck is the matter with that kid? They get him off gluten and he's fine. I haven't seen it too often, but it happens. So think about allergies. Low vitamin, amino acid levels, okay? There's a thing called a spectrocell analysis that will look at amino acids. Amino acids are the precursors to your neurotransmitters. If your amino acid for like tyrosine is low, it's the precursor to dopamine. So your dopamine's going to low, you're going to be inattentive. That doesn't mean you can just eat tyrosine. You got to take a pill that has a transporter to get it into the brain. But genetic syndromes, some of these can be very, very subtle. We saw a child recently we think had Fragile X. Some of these disorders, you don't have to have all the symptoms to meet criteria, but it's worth it to get the blood checked to see if it's there, because it's going to narrow how we're going to do treatment or not. Psychiatry. Make sure they understand development. They didn't, work with adults, turn around and see kids. This is really important. Make sure the psychiatrist understands gifted. If you ask them a couple of questions about your on the phone, they can't answer it intelligently, go to somebody else. If they make too much out of silly stuff like toe walking, you know what toe walking means? We've all seen it, right? What do people think it means? Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. Tie heel cord, doesn't mean a thing. Now flapping could, but I know adults that flap. You watch a game show, adults flap. It doesn't always mean that it's pathological. Eye contact You know, there's a difference between looking away from someone and having eye avoidance, right? That's a big difference. Eye avoidance would be more, gaze avoidance, maybe more autism. Hyperkinesis is hyperactivity. You got to think of the situation. I mean, if it's Christmas morning, yeah, you're going to be pretty hyper, right? Or distractibility, same kind of thing. If they're, repaving outside, you might get distracted easy. So, let's see. With a neuropsychologist, I look at everything. I want to find out everything to rule out everything. So I'm going to test IQ, achievement, learning disability stuff, attention, learning memory, and so on. And then the question spectrum disorder will test that too. If you go to a psychologist and your child is gifted, ask them what their training is. So what that means is this. Anybody should give you 5 to 10 minutes on the phone, if not a half hour free. This is your kid. If you got some questions, I take phone calls all the time. I've spent 40 minutes, I do it too much. I spent 40 minutes on the phone with people, right? And it's no skin off my nose, really, to answer a few questions and help a parent decide, well, what's the next appropriate move? Do I get testing or don't I get testing? That sort of thing. If someone isn't willing to do that with you, they're really showing you why they're in the business or not. Are you there to help people or are you there to make money? Okay? I know people that'll charge you $40 for a fax. Crazy, right? $300 for a letter. It's insane. So will they take a short phone call at times also when you're their patient, or is it always blowing you off? We return calls within 24 hours. It's our office policy. Do they bill you for a fax or a short letter? We've recently started billing for letters because it takes time. Are they more about money than your child? And again, do they know about gifted? If they can't answer that, if they answer wrong, that doesn't mean that much, don't go to them, right? The thing I think a lot of people forget, if you have a doctor, that's your employee. They're not bigger than you, right? It's your employee. If you don't like what they say, go to somebody else. And with that,